Our first speaker is Dr. Gerald Hyman. He's a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, one of the great think tanks of the United States, indeed of the world. And he's president there of the Hills Program on Governance. This is a unique program. Hills program is focused on improving governance, both civil and political, private and political governance around the world, a particular focus on corruption. It is at the center of a network of 7 centers scattered in Asia, primarily Seoul, Beijing, Jakarta, and Manila, but also in Mexico City and Nairobi. His political, I should say his academic life has been primarily teaching at Smith and at Williams. He's an anthropologist, a PhD in anthropology from University of Chicago. He's also has a doctorate in law, doctorate in law from the University of Virginia, and so he's also practiced law. But most of his career, he's been with the Agency for International Development, which is one of the great institutions born out of the aftermath of World War II, in which the United States has tried to share both its knowledge and its resources with countries around the world that need assistance. And so we're delighted to have Dr. Hyman with us. He's most recently been in Afghanistan in the spring for a month, consulting and advising the U.S. government. And he's also spent some time recently in Pakistan. So we're asking him now to talk to us about the political dimension of the AFPAC challenge. Gerald?
Wants to go up there? Is that
You can do it either way.
okay? Can you hear me? Okay, try to speak loud and speak quickly. General Jordan and Director Williams, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. And great pleasure to be here in beautiful mountains, and I'm probably going to just stay here and not go back. If you don't mind, I'm going to read this just so I can get through the time limitations rather than just speaking from notes. For the 3rd time in the past half-century, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, we are engaged in an agonizing national debate about our military engagement abroad. What are we doing there? Where are we going? What is our plan? How, if at all, can we succeed? At what cost? Is the cost worth the benefit? Questions, some of which at least ought to have been answered prospectively, now seem to expose a jumble of uncertainty. General McChrystal has produced a review which analyzes several options, not just one, each with its intended estimates of success, cost, and risk. He apparently recommends the high option, and once again, as in Vietnam and Iraq, we are split almost exactly in half. 47% of Americans polled last week by ABC and the Washington Post favored the maximum build-up option in General McChrystal's scenarios. 49% oppose it. Both hold their views, quote, strongly. Just a third of the president's party favors that option. 60% oppose it. President Obama sensibly says he will approve no additional troop commitments, high, medium, or low, without a credible strategy for success. He will not approve additional troops even if, as General McChrystal says, we are losing the struggle now. But just as the president correctly, in my view, insists on a credible strategy for success, there can be no successful strategy without clear objectives. It is all but impossible to forge a strategy without knowing where the strategy is supposed to lead and what it is supposed to achieve. Almost impossible to plan to get to a place you haven't identified. What does success mean in Afghanistan? What are our objectives and purposes, and what should they be? The debate at the moment between an anti-terrorism strategy and an anti-insurgency strategy is in substantial measure, I think, a debate about objectives, not just about means for achieving them. The supporters of the anti-terrorism strategy propose to target al-Qaeda, not the Taliban as a whole. It is al-Qaeda, not the Taliban, who attacked New York, London, Madrid, and other places, they argue. It is al-Qaeda that has the global perspective in which the West in general and the U.S. in particular is the enemy. The Taliban, on the other hand, are local, not global, they say. The Taliban are rooted in and care about Afghanistan. They care about the U.S. and the West, this argument posits, because we are in Afghanistan. Were we out of Afghanistan, the Taliban would say of us, as Muhammad Ali said when he was called up to go to Vietnam, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." True, the Taliban were hosts to al-Qaeda, but al-Qaeda could find many hosts, in Yemen and Somalia to name just two, and the Taliban could perhaps be convinced to refuse sanctuary to al-Qaeda, or at least the majority could. Consequently, this argument goes, the strategy should target al-Qaeda specifically and not try to make Afghanistan into what Secretary of Defense Gates called a Central Asian Valhalla. The counterinsurgency side argues that Afghanistan can never be free from al-Qaeda unless it is secure, and the Taliban are also contained. No one ever thought that Afghanistan would be a Valhalla for anything, at least in our lifetime, they say. But unless we leave a stable, reasonably functioning state in Afghanistan and one unthreatened by the Taliban, we will leave exactly where we started, with the best possible haven for al-Qaeda, one from which they can and will use as a base to attack us or others again. That requires an anti-insurgency strategy to defeat the Taliban, or at least to to render it a chronic nuisance, but not a substantial or potential successor regime to the government in Kabul. Target attacks against al-Qaeda are almost impossible, will not neuter them, will mean bombing Pakistan at the least, and will be endless in this view. An anti-insurgency strategy means more than just targeted attacks against al-Qaeda or even Taliban bases, especially by air and especially in Pakistan. It means rooting out terrorists and insurgents and defeating them or containing them, ultimately area by area. Air attacks are useful as an adjunct tactic and would without doubt be safer for ISAF forces, resulting in fewer casualties, therefore probably a more politically acceptable strategy domestically, but they would also be less surgical and less enduring. The collateral damage of air attacks alone tends to create additional enemies. In Pakistan, we may be creating more terrorists than we are eliminating with drone attacks. And an anti-insurgency strategy also increases the cost in lives, equipment, funding, and U.S. commitment to a large ground operation. So that is the policy debate. Would an anti-terrorist strategy work? What would work mean? Is an anti-insurgency strategy winnable in Afghanistan? Under what conditions? Is the cost worth the benefit? Whatever the 2001 decision we wish we had made in hindsight, how should we proceed now? What are our options? As is now widely said, correctly in my view, there are no good options in Afghanistan, only poor, bad, and worse. Assuming for this morning that the preferable objective is a stable, peaceful Afghanistan that lives in harmony with its neighbors and does not harbor terrorists, and assuming that an anti-insurgency strategy rather than anti-terrorism strategy is required to get there, what options do we have in effecting it? Others will deal with the military and economic options and scenarios. I will deal with the political ones primarily in Afghanistan, but also, because it is impossible to separate the two realistically, time permitting, with Pakistan. Politically, I propose that there is only one course, not several options, and that the discussion ought to center on how to create a credible strategy for securing that strategy. And I know this is controversial. The strategy runs through, I believe, a more democratic Afghanistan. And I hope to convince you of that. Unfortunately, I do not have a credible strategy for getting there, I do have some thoughts about what that strategy ought to contain, but not very realistic thoughts about how that can be achieved. Rahm Emanuel, the White House Chief of Staff, may have more experience in domestic than in foreign policy, but I believe he is exactly right when he said last week, whatever the President's decision about strategy and troop levels, we cannot succeed without a reasonably credible, effective partner in Kabul. Quote, it would be reckless to make a decision on troop levels if in fact you haven't done a thorough analysis of whether in fact there is an Afghan partner ready to fill the space that U.S. troops would create and become a true partner in governing, quote. The central question, he said, is, quote, not how many troops you have, but whether there is an Afghan partner, quote. Senator John Kerry, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, whose primary concern is foreign policy, agrees on that point at least. Karzai, he recently said, last week, must have a credible and legitimate election and result. There must be a credible government and a legitimate process to the Afghan people. The central question at the heart of the review is not how many troops you send, but whether you also have a credible Afghan partner. It would be entirely irresponsible for the President of the United States to commit more troops to this country when we don't have an election finished and know who the President is and what kind of government we are working with, quote. So what would it take to build a legitimate, credible Afghan partner, and how do we get there? It is much in vogue now to deride democracy as a goal. It is a bridge too far, according to Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. It is part of the Central Asian Valhalla in the view of Secretary Gates. I hope to convince you today that democracy is the right course to pursue, not just because American sacrifices, especially by our military, should be made in the service of an objective we believe in, but because, values aside, democracy is the only realistic road to a credible partner in Afghanistan. First, as I said, no one thought Afghanistan would be even remotely confused with Valhalla, whether politically or economically or in any other way, let alone that it should be a U.S. objective. Second, nurturing democracy is easy to parody. It is absurd, presumably, to believe that democracy is the best strategy for a country like Afghanistan, some argue. And it is absurd to think that foreign powers could turn Afghanistan into one. At best, the Afghans are responsible for their own country, their own polity, and their own future. The last part is unquestionable in my view, but not the first part. Or to put it more accurately, we need to take democracy's components apart to see what is desirable, what is possible, and what is neither. What would a democratic Afghanistan look like, and how different would that be from the, quote, credible partner, quote, the administration officials and congressional leaders say we need in Afghanistan? I've spent over 20 years puzzling about democracy, its elements, and the ways by which it can be promoted. I propose that it is useful to think of democracy in terms of 5 core elements, not one. First, is there consensus about the rules of the game? And all of these 5 are part of a democracy. And the part that is also a part of democracy, but only one part, is the competition and electoral part, which we'll get to in a moment. So first, is there consensus about the rules of the game? Is there consensus about the fundamentals of the state, in this case, the Afghan state? What is the nature of society, the individual, and the state? Who is in and who is out? What is the nature of citizenship? What are the boundaries of the state? What are the rules of achieving, holding, and relinquishing power? What is the nature of a peaceful political game? What are the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority? What are the rights of every citizen? If these issues are not settled, they dominate the political landscape. There's no way to get around them. You can't get to other political issues if those fundamental core issues are at risk, as they are in Afghanistan and in many other countries. So first, is there consensus about certain fundamental political rules and objectives? That's not to say there needs to be consensus about tax policy or hospital care or water rights. Those are precisely the issues about which there is dispute. But if there is not agreement about the nature of the state and who's in and who's out, you can't get to the next set of questions. And in too many countries around the world, that consensus is missing. Second, there needs to be competition in a democracy. Elections are the most obvious example of competition, but not the only ones. So is there a competition of ideas? Is there a free media and free association to express and debate those ideas? Are there checks and balances within the government of the country? Are there horizontal checks and balances between the center and the periphery? Is there enough competition so that there is no dominant force, so that there is no autocracy, no authoritarian government? The absence of competition is part of what an authoritarian government is about, and that is the antithesis of what democracy is about. So free and fair elections, formalized and routine, and required and regulated by publicly accessible rules, norms, and laws are central to competition, but they are not the only part of competition. And it is the continuing confusion of elections with competition and competition with democracy that, in my opinion, clouds the political debate about democracy. Elections are central to competition. Competition is central to democracy, but they are not the only parts. We've only talked about two: consensus and competition. 3, the rule of law. Is there ordered liberty? Is politics bound by laws that are substantively and procedurally fair? Is there justice in matters of civil dispute and criminal action? Are there fundamental human rights and civil liberties? And so on. 4th, is there good governance? Democracy is a form of governance. It is about governance. It is about how to achieve good governance and how to sustain good governance. It is about government and political services on the one hand, but it is also about private social institutions of the society. Are social institutions working well? Do they achieve what they're supposed to achieve? If not, how do you get better public and private governance? And how do they work both in the public sector and the private sector? I realize I'm rushing through what are long and complicated issues, which perhaps we can take up in the discussion. But that good governance is part of what a democracy is about. So that's number 4. And number 5, is there inclusion or exclusion? Are parts of the population formally and legally or informally, but practically and actively or passively excluded from and disenfranchised from meaningful social, political, and economic participation, whether on the basis of ethnicity, geography, language, gender, religion, race, or some other such ascriptive criterion. So those are the 5 elements that I propose are part of a democracy, not just elections: consensus, competition, rule of law, good governance, inclusion. Considering these 5 elements one by one with Afghanistan in mind, what is the nature of a credible partner that could emerge from Afghanistan, if not a democratic one? About 6 months ago, I led a team of 3 for several weeks in Afghanistan doing just that, as General Jordan mentioned. We interviewed an admittedly non-random group of over 150 Afghans of all stripes and walks of life. We began an open-ended discussion by asking what the biggest political problems were in Afghanistan. No matter whom we asked, no matter at what level, whether garden gatekeepers at the village level or ministers, they independently voiced 3 grievances about the present state in Afghanistan. First, security. Second, justice. Third, good governance. There was no dissent. Not a single person didn't mention all 3 of those elements. Remember them: security, justice, and good governance. And remember that they were not the team's suggestions and were not ingredients in a multiple choice poll, but the independent, spontaneous response of Afghans to an open-ended question of what are the problems in Afghanistan today. The consensus problem, to go back to the 5 issues that are at the basis of democracy, it seems to me, is always the most difficult. At least 4 consensus issues divide Afghanistans in fundamental constitutional ways. And again, I'll just try to get through them quickly. We can perhaps talk about them in the discussion. First, what role, if any, should the Taliban play? And what role should be the role of Islam? Indeed, should there be a predominant interpretation of Islam in Afghanistan? If so, what should it be, and how should it be enforced? Second, to what extent should the country be centralized as against a decentralized, with a strong or a weak central government? The modernizing, globalizing elite in Kabul and the Pashtuns in the south and the east support a strong central government, although for different reasons. Those in Kabul, especially in the government, recognize that some of Afghanistan's rulers have tried unsuccessfully in the past to build a strong center and believe that Afghanistan cannot be even a reasonably prosperous part of a world community without a strong central government, of which, of course, they would be a part. They do not see how it is possible to build and create a central Afghanistan without a stable Afghanistan without a strong central government. The Pashtuns, concentrated in the south and the east, believe that as the plurality population, they are the natural rulers of Afghanistan and that they should be at the center of governance. Some do, and many others, like the Taliban, do not agree, however, about a globalized Afghanistan. The other communities in Afghanistan, however, particularly in the north and the west, believe that the attempt to create a strong central government dominated by the Pashtuns is precisely what would contribute to Afghanistan's destabilization rather than stabilization, as the minority communities chafe at Pashtun and Kabul dominance. Third, to what extent should Afghanistan attempt to adopt formal systems patterned on those of the rest of the world, and to what extent should it retain traditional governance based on local traditions? You can see that that is connected to the question of centralization versus decentralization. Fourth, but infusing the other 3, what is the role of the Pashtuns and their code, the Pashtunwali, as the basis of governance in Afghanistan? These are all complicated questions, much more complicated than this simple exposition suggests, but they lie at the core of what an Afghan state should look like. They affect whether Afghanistan can survive as a peaceful, coherent state, irrespective of regime type. They require resolution if the temporary and contingent, even if temporarily and contingently, before any other questions can be resolved. What is the role of the Taliban? What is the role of religion? Should the state be central or decentralized? What is the role of the Pashtuns? These are questions that you can't get beyond if you're going to deal with any other element of the politics of Afghanistan. The third and the fourth, so that's consensus. The third and the fourth constituent elements of democracy are, remember, the rule of law and good governance. 2 of the 3 elements cited universally by the Afghans themselves, not by democracy imposing West, let alone by the United States, for what is wrong with Afghanistan. Justice, good governance, and security. 2 of those are 2 of the 5 elements of democracy. Their absence is the almost entire explanation of how the Taliban rode to rapid victory in the first place. In a chaotic Afghanistan, at war and under the dispersed control of local or regional warlords, Afghans gave the Taliban, which promised justice and good governance, the public support for their astonishing triumph over the much better armed but mutually warring factions under the warlords. No ISAF military commander believes that any kind of anti-insurgency success, no matter how it is defined, is even remotely possible by military means alone without substantial progress on these 2 elements of democracy, the rule of law and good governance. Yet the levels of deep and widespread corruption and the nearly total ineffectiveness of the Karzai government are at the roots of the policy anguish, not merely in the White House on the Hill and in NATO and in Europe, but more importantly in Kabul, Baghlan, Kunduz, Herat, and Paktia, where our team asked about the problems of Afghanistan. So there is no dispute about the need for some greater consensus, rule of law, and governance, 3 of the 5 elements of a potentially democratic Afghanistan. That leaves 2 other elements of democracy, competition and inclusion. Competition is certainly one element at the heart of a critique of democracy as an objective in Afghanistan and elsewhere as well. It is the usually cited span of the so-called, quote, bridge too far. Competition, it is said, is too destabilizing and becomes too quickly violent in a place like Afghanistan, especially electoral competition. The Afghans need time, it is argued, before they can understand and practice civilized competition, let alone elections. They need the rule of law and good governance first. Then we can talk about elections. First, pass over the fundamental social dissensus that we talked about a few minutes ago and the difficulties of sequencing these elements in a country which, at war with itself, cannot get even the most essential elements of governance straight. How are you going to sequence how this sequence is supposed to be accomplished when even the broader basic social order is at issue is unclear. Second, how exactly will a legitimate government be assembled, and a credible government at that? Well, and how, without a government legitimate in the eyes of most, if not all, Afghans, how will it govern? How will it be a credible partner? How will it help create the rule of law and good governance that everyone seems to agree is necessary for success in Afghanistan? How will it achieve legitimacy? This is no longer a world of Afghan divine monarchies. Governance without legitimacy can survive based on pure force. It can survive based on inertia, on abject policy in which no one has the energy to revolt. But absent legitimacy, any such governance is inherently insecure and unstable in the 21st century. At the very least, these are not the kinds of governments that can produce or have an interest in producing the rule of law, for example, or good governance, that is, illegitimate governments. These are the kinds of regimes that, at best, can force or a parity of law on their population, but do so without a law that is without justice. And note that Afghans want justice, not just order and law. And they do so these kinds of regimes that are not legitimate do so uncertainly because of the oppositions like the Taliban that threaten them in a world of law without justice. Third, who is it that is, quote, talking about elections, as in the, quote, then we can talk about elections? Not the Afghans. They wanted the elections. They included elections in the January 2004 Constitution adopted by the 2003 Loya Jirga. In fact, the only credible alternative to an elected government, much less discussed in articles written outside Afghanistan, is some kind of loya jirga. But how possible would another loya jirga be in 2010, even if it were seen as legitimate, and even if it could bestow legitimacy on its conclusion? Who would choose the elders to attend the loya jirga, and how would it be done? The old traditional loya jirgas had much more limited mandates, were much more localized, were not redrafting constitutions. Moreover, many of the so-called co-traditional leaders of the old loya jirgas have been killed or have migrated, have been the victims of the warlords and the Taliban, and have been the victims of many other depredations of conflict and near chaos in Afghanistan. They are not around. Fourth, the so-called traditional Afghan traditional system, which in fact consisted of many highly decentralized traditional systems in different parts of the country, not just one central traditional system, is dead. It has been destroyed again by violence, but also, among other things, by labor migration, by the forces of globalization, and because of many other consumer products and services that globalization has brought. So it is far from clear that a loya jirga of recognized legitimate elders could be assembled, even if that were the preferred course. Fifth, most politically powerful Afghans do not want another loya jirga because too many constitutional issues, which were temporarily, quote, settled in 2002, would be reopened by such a loya jirga, and very possibly to the disadvantage of the politically powerful. Finally, it was the 2000 loya jirga itself, as I said, that included elections in the Constitution in the first place. No doubt without much prompting and arm twisting, but nevertheless adopted by the loya jirga. It was the loya jirga, the much recommended Council of Elders, that chose elections as a way of keeping the government accountable and in turn of limiting its mandate and choosing its successors. Somehow the many architects who prefer some other non-electoral way of getting a good and accountable government need to explain how, outside of popular elections, they propose to create a legitimate government, and how to create it accountable, and how to attain and then sustain the good governance they hope to establish. The Afghans have chosen elections as their best hope of doing so. If there is a competitor process, what is it? Who chose it? And why do we prefer some other system and believe that it will work better? Plain and simple, there is no better scheme on offer, and none acceptable to the Afghans. There is another option, of course, a Taliban victory by force. But a Taliban victory has no popular support in Afghanistan and is not likely to produce either a legitimate government or peace, but rather continued civil war or a reign of terror, or both. Maybe in the discussion we can talk about the Asia Foundation's just released on Tuesday poll of Afghans, 87% of whom, in a random poll, preferred democracy to any other form of government, just as starters. Finally, there is an obvious casualty of abandoning democracy as a goal, and at least as the likely the least likely that casualty should be we should at least recognize that casualty in our policy deliberations. The most likely casualty of abandoning democracy as a goal is that last democracy issue, the element of inclusion, which is also a function, in this case, of the rule of law. If there is a negotiation with the so-called reconcilable Taliban, who object to the predations of the current government, the corruption, the inefficiency, and the fecklessness in Kabul, the issues on the negotiating table with these so-called reconcilable Taliban, without doubt, will include the role of women and the role and content of civil liberties. The reconcilable Taliban, not the Al-Qaedas, the reconcilable Taliban, are adamantly opposed to equality for women. They view equality not only as a violation of the Pashtunwali, the Pashtun code, of which they are the primary enforcers, but as a violation of Islam itself. Recall that the position of women under the Taliban and the draconian Taliban measures which denied women basic health and education and political participation, to say nothing of equality, political, social, and economic. Indeed, civil liberties in general will be substantially curtailed, at least in the areas controlled by the reconciled Taliban, and probably in other areas as well. The freedom to speak, to express views, to criticize, to organize, to worship will be at risk, indeed almost certainly substantially curtailed in an Afghanistan dominated by the so-called reconcilable Taliban, especially in the Pashtun areas of the south and the east, and probably to a lesser extent throughout the country as a whole. Surely no one will be able for many decades to voice any dissent from the prevailing social, political, or religious practices, which, to be sure, will vary some from area to area. But nowhere in Afghanistan under the Taliban will resemble anything even remotely akin to even an authoritarian country like Egypt, Cambodia, or Kazakhstan, let alone one like Morocco, Jordan, or of course the current Afghanistan. Anyone supporting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will need to include an asterisk on universality for Afghanistan. These are not, in my opinion, reasons to go to war, but they will certainly be casualties of our withdrawal from Afghanistan now that we are there. We should not put our young men and women into war, let alone commit the funds and energy currently at stake in Afghanistan elsewhere, if these values are challenged, or in every other stable country theoretically hospitable to terrorists. We would be at war. We should not be putting our young men and women just for those values, at risk for those values. We would be at war in too many places. We cannot justify that code or that commitment, in my view, if we were to put our forces at risk for just those services. And we would not succeed even if we tried. But we should at least recognize that these are likely fatalities of an anti-terrorism as against an anti-insurgency objective, leaving aside questions of our own security and our only likelihood of success in helping to build a stable Afghanistan that would live in minimal harmony with its global and regional neighbors. In short, the way ahead in Afghanistan on the civilian side, in my opinion, is to support a democratic Afghanistan, as idealistic as that may sound and as difficult to achieve as it may be. The clear requirements of a counterinsurgency strategy are completely compatible with those of a democratic Afghanistan, however flawed it may be. There is no other strategic option. If that is the bridge too far, then so too, in my opinion, is the prospect of a credible partner for a counterinsurgency strategy. The only alternative is to leave Afghanistan entirely and take our chances, and so far, only a few are recommending that option. The policy matter, then, is not a choice of objectives, at least on the civilian side, but rather a roadmap for getting there. Diagnosis is easy, prescriptions and solutions are hard. President Karzai will almost surely be the next elected president of Afghanistan. How likely is it that he will change path to become the credible partner needed in Kabul? How can we encourage or pressure, perhaps even force that change? the signs are not auspicious. Between his personality and his networks of clientage and patronage, it would be optimistic, to say the least, to foresee these changes. An old saying has it that when you borrow $100,000 from the bank has you in a hammerlock. If you borrow $100 million, you have the bank in a hammerlock. Karzai has us in a hammerlock. What leverage do we have, and how can we use it? We need to find a way to drive better performance in the face of powerful but inimical political interests, including the corrupt relatives and close colleagues in their cabinet. Some have suggested alternatives to President Karzai, but who would they be and how would they gain power? The various warlords like Mohammed Fahim or Yunus Kanuni or Abdul Rashid Dostum are not obvious prospects for a better, let alone a democratic governance in Afghanistan. Even if they were, how would we help engineer their ascent to power? Can we instead strengthen institutions of performance and accountability to balance the power and centrality of the presidency? If so, the courts and the parliaments will need to be strengthened, more independent and more committed to their own serious performance of integrity. As to corruption, some have suggested that ISAF should have a more active role in arresting corrupt public officials, rather than leaving it to the corruption-ridden Afghan National Police or their prosecutors. How would that lead to a long-term Afghan solution? And even in the short term, where would they be tried unless the courts became, as the Afghans say, places of justice? What kinds of positive and negative incentives can the international forces, civil and military, mount to create procedures that will meet Afghan expectations of security, justice, and good governance? I don't have good answers to those questions, but the only option that has a chance, it seems to me, is the construction of democratic institutions, procedures, and attitudes. That would be consistent with our own objectives for a credible partner in Kabul, and more important, that is what ordinary Afghans want for themselves.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hyman, for a marvelous exposition. I'm confused at a higher level than when you started.
That's what these symposia are supposed to do, confuse you at a higher level.
I'm perplexed as to where we go, but perhaps this can be clarified in the Q&A session.